The six of them, Ethan, Clara, Rachel, Marcus, Oliver, and Sophia, had planned this trip for months. A snow hiking expedition in the remote wilderness of Montana sounded like the perfect winter escape. The goal was to traverse a little-used trail that wound its way through the Bitterroot Range, a challenge they were eager to conquer. The first few days were everything they hoped for. The landscape was breathtaking, endless snowy expanses, towering pines cloaked in frost, and a silence so profound it felt sacred. But by the fourth day, the weather began to turn. Clouds rolled in, thick and gray, blotting out the sun. A bitter wind picked up, and the temperature dropped sharply. "Looks like a storm's coming," Ethan muttered, glancing at the sky. "We should find a place to camp," Clara suggested, her voice tense. As they hurried to pitch their tents, snow began to fall, soft at first, then in heavy, blinding waves. By nightfall, the storm had become a full-blown whiteout. Huddled in their tents, the group tried to stay warm and ignore the sound of the wind battering the fabric. That's when Sophia heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the storm. It wasn't the wind, it was a distant, mournful wail. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Rachel, who was sharing her tent. "Hear what?" It sounded like someone screaming. Rachel shook her head. "It's just the wind. Go to sleep." But Sophia couldn't. The sound came again, louder this time. It was unmistakably human. By morning, the storm had only worsened, but the group decided to press on. They couldn't afford to stay put with supplies dwindling. Visibility was almost zero as they trudged through the snow, the world around them reduced to a swirling void of white. That's when they found the first set of footprints. They were fresh, partially covered by the falling snow, and led off the trail into the trees. "Who would be out here?" Marcus asked, frowning. "No one's supposed to be on this trail but us," Clara said. "Maybe it's a lost hiker," Oliver suggested. "We should follow them." Reluctantly, the group left the trail, following the tracks deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, their branches heavy with snow, and the air grew eerily quiet. The tracks led them to a clearing where they abruptly stopped, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, looking around. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. The group froze, scanning the trees. The growl came again, closer this time. A shadow moved between the trees, too fast and too large to be human. "Back to the trail." Clara shouted, and they ran, their hearts pounding. But the trail was gone. The storm had covered their tracks, leaving them stranded in an endless expanse of snow and trees. After hours of wandering, they stumbled upon an old lodge, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking in the wind. "Better than freezing out here," Marcus said, though no one looked convinced. Inside, the lodge was cold and dark. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling away to reveal rotting wood. A large fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth filled with ashes. "We can wait out the storm here," Ethan said, trying to sound optimistic. As night fell, they lit a fire and tried to make themselves comfortable. But the unease lingered. The lodge felt wrong, as if something unseen was watching them. Then the knocking started. It was faint at first, a soft tap-tap-tap at the front door. "Who's out there?" Oliver called, but no one answered. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. When Ethan opened the door, there was nothing but the storm. The group retreated to the main room, their nerves frayed. But the knocking returned, this time from the windows. The sound moved around the lodge, as though whatever was outside was circling them. And then came the voices. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. They grew louder, echoing through the lodge. "It's calling our names," Sophia whispered, her face pale. "It's just the storm," Ethan insisted, though his voice trembled. Suddenly, the fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers turned into screams, agonized, in human wails that seemed to shake the walls. Upstairs, Clara shouted, grabbing Sophia's arm. They ran up the creaking stairs, but the second floor was no refuge. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in a dark, dried substance. Doors slammed open and shut on their own, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the chaos. But when they tried to leave, they found the front door wouldn't budge. "What's happening?" Rachel screamed, clawing at the door. Through the shattered windows, they saw figures moving in the storm. They were tall and gaunt, their faces pale and featureless. One by one, the group was separated in the chaos. Ethan and Clara tried to stay together, but when he turned a corner, she was gone. Sophia's screams echoed through the lodge, followed by silence. By morning, the storm had cleared. A search party, alerted by the group's overdue return, found the lodge. It was empty, save for strange symbols etched into the walls and floor. There were no signs of the hikers, only a single sentence scrawled across the fireplace in ash. "The snow remembers." No one has ever been able to explain what happened to the group, but locals now speak of the lodge in hushed tones, warning hikers to stay away. They say that on stormy nights, you can still hear the whispers of those who were lost, carried on the howling wind. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Mark, Sarah, Liam, Emma, and Jake were avid hikers, always seeking their next thrill. This time, they had chosen the remote Alaskan wilderness, lured by its pristine beauty and endless white landscapes. Despite warnings from locals about the area's treacherous storms and strange stories of disappearances, the group brushed them off as superstition. They were experienced and prepared, or so they thought. The first 2 days were uneventful, even idyllic. The trail was blanketed in snow, and the world around them was silent except for the crunch of their boots and the occasional crack of ice. At night, they sat around a small campfire, their laughter filling the cold air. But as they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the atmosphere began to shift. On the third day, the weather turned. A thick blanket of clouds rolled in, and the wind carried a sharp chill. By late afternoon, a blizzard had swallowed the trail, forcing them to stop early and set up camp. The snow fell in relentless sheets, and the howling wind battered their tents. It was during that night that Liam first heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, soft whispers carried on the wind. He dismissed it as his imagination and pulled his sleeping bag tighter around himself. But the sound persisted, growing clearer and more insistent. It wasn't just the wind. "Liam, are you awake?" Sarah's voice broke the silence inside the tent. "Yeah," he whispered back. "Do you hear that?" Before he could answer, Emma unzipped her sleeping bag. "It sounds like voices," she said, her face pale. Jake laughed nervously. "You're all hearing things. It's just the wind." But the whispers grew louder, and soon everyone was awake, their eyes wide with unease. They sounded distant but distinct, like words spoken in a language they couldn't understand. Sleep eluded them that night. By morning, the storm had worsened. Visibility was near zero, and the temperature had dropped dangerously low. Reluctantly, they pressed on, hoping to find better shelter. Hours later, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin in the middle of a clearing. The structure was old and partially buried in snow, its wooden frame weathered by time. Strange symbols were carved into the door and windows, their meaning unknown. "We don't have a choice," Mark said, shoving the creaking door open. Inside, the cabin was dark and freezing, with a lingering smell of damp wood and decay. A single fireplace stood in the center, surrounded by crude furniture. They quickly lit a fire and huddled around it, grateful for the shelter despite the unsettling atmosphere. As night fell, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They seemed to come from the woods surrounding the cabin, echoing through the storm. "I swear I saw something," Emma whispered, staring out the frosted window. Something tall, moving between the trees. Jake, ever the skeptic, grabbed a flashlight. "Enough of this nonsense. I'm checking it out." "Don't go out there," Sarah pleaded, But Jake ignored her and stepped into the storm. Minutes turned to an hour, and Jake didn't return.
Panic set in.
Mark and Sarah decided to search for him, leaving Liam and Emma behind. Outside, the blizzard was a swirling wall of white, their shouts swallowed by the wind. They found Jake's flashlight half buried in the snow, its beam flickering weakly. Nearby were footprints, large and clawed, unlike anything human. Before they could process what they were seeing, a shadow passed between the trees. It was impossibly tall, with glowing eyes that stared at them before vanishing into the storm. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, and they ran back to the cabin, their breaths ragged with fear. Inside, they found Emma curled in a corner, sobbing. "Liam's gone," she choked out. "He went outside to find you. I told him not to, but the whispers they called him." Suddenly, the whispers filled the cabin, louder and closer than ever. They seemed to come from everywhere surrounding them. The walls creaked, and the fire sputtered. Something scratched at the door, a slow, deliberate sound that sent chills down their spines. Mark and Sarah barricaded the door as the scratching grew more aggressive. Then came a loud thud, as though something massive was trying to force its way in. The whispers became words, chilling and inhuman. "Come outside." The next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving an eerie silence. A rescue team, alerted by the group's emergency beacon, found the cabin. It was empty, the furniture overturned and strange symbols carved into the walls and floor. Only Emma was found days later, wandering miles from the site. Frostbitten and delirious, she repeated the same phrase over and over. The storm took them. To this day, locals warn hikers to avoid the area during blizzards. They say the wind carries voices, and if you listen too closely, you might never return. For years, Mount Arion had been a forbidden peak, towering over the Alaskan range. Its slopes were steep, its weather brutal, and its reputation steeped in mystery. Local legends spoke of climbers who vanished without a trace, their voices said to echo through the snow long after they were gone. But to Max, Julia, Alex, and Brianna, the stories were just that, stories. They were experienced hikers, ready for the challenge. The journey started as expected. Clear skies and crisp air welcomed them as they made their ascent. The snow sparkled under the sunlight, and the group's spirits were high. They laughed off the old tales, dismissing them as folklore meant to scare tourists. But as they climbed higher, the weather began to shift. The wind picked up, carrying an eerie whistle that seemed almost musical. The temperature plummeted, and by late afternoon, thick clouds had rolled in, shrouding the peak in a ghostly gray haze. "We should set up camp here," Max suggested, glancing at the ominous sky. Reluctantly, they agreed. The group pitched their tents on a small plateau, sheltered slightly by a ridge. As night fell, the wind grew stronger, rattling the fabric of their tents. And then, faintly at first, they heard it, a low, mournful hum carried by the wind. It was soft, almost like a distant chant. "What is that?" Brianna asked, peeking out of her sleeping bag. "Probably just the wind through the rocks," Alex said, though his voice betrayed his unease. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, rising and falling like a melody, surrounding them in the darkness. The group barely slept that night, and by morning, the storm had worsened. Snow fell in thick, blinding waves, and the path ahead disappeared under a fresh blanket of white. "We should head back," Julia said, her voice firm. "It's too dangerous to keep going." "We're not far from the summit," Max argued. "If we turn back now, everything we've done will be for nothing." After a tense debate, they decided to press on. But the further they climbed, the stranger things became. Halfway to the summit, they stumbled upon something unexpected, an abandoned campsite. 3 snow-covered tents stood in a small circle, their fabric torn and flapping in the wind. Scattered around them were climbing gear, boots, and backpacks, frozen stiff. "No one reported a missing group up here recently," Julia said, frowning. "It looks old," Brianna replied, brushing snow off a tent to reveal a layer of frost beneath. Inside the tents, they found more gear, untouched and perfectly arranged, as if the hikers had stepped out and never returned. "That doesn't make sense," Alex muttered. "Why would they leave everything behind?" Then they noticed the footprints, dozens of them, all leading away from the camp. The tracks meandered aimlessly, overlapping and crisscrossing, but they all led in the same direction, toward the edge of a steep cliff. "There's no way," Julia whispered, staring at the drop. The group hurried back to their own gear, shaken but determined to reach the summit and descend as quickly as possible. By the time they reached the final stretch, the storm had turned ferocious. The wind screamed through the rocks, carrying with it the same eerie hum they had heard the night before. But now, the sound had changed. It wasn't a hum, it was whispers. Faint at first, then louder. Distinct. "They're calling my name," Brianna said suddenly, her face pale. "Don't listen," Julia snapped, grabbing her arm. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were everywhere, in the wind, in the snow, in the very ground beneath their feet. Max, Julia. The voices were familiar, mimicking the tones of loved ones, their words laced with desperation. "Help us. Please don't leave us here." "I can't. I have to," Max stammered, stepping toward the edge. "Max, no," Alex shouted, pulling him back. But it was too late for Brianna. She dropped her pack and began walking toward the sound, her expression blank. "Brianna, stop," Julia yelled, chasing after her. Brianna turned, her eyes wide and tear-filled. "Don't you hear them? They're trapped. I have to help." Before anyone could stop her, she disappeared into the blizzard. The remaining three pressed on, desperate to find shelter. When they finally reached the summit, they found something that chilled them to the bone, a ring of carved stones, half buried in the snow. Strange symbols were etched into their surfaces, glowing faintly in the storm's dim light. "I don't like this," Alex said, backing away. But as they turned to leave, the storm intensified. The wind roared, and the whispers became screams. Shadowy figures emerged from the blizzard, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke. "They're everywhere," Julia cried, stumbling back. Max and Alex grabbed her and ran, descending blindly through the storm. The shadows pursued them, their twisted forms stretching unnaturally, their whispers turning to guttural snarls. When the storm finally cleared, only Max and Julia emerged from the mountain. Exhausted and frostbitten, they stumbled into the base camp where rescuers waited. "Where's Alex? Where's Brianna?" one of the rescuers asked. "They're gone," Julia whispered, her eyes hollow. "The mountain it took them." No one believed their story of whispers and shadows, but locals weren't surprised. They spoke of Mount Arion's curse, of the voices that lured hikers to their doom. To this day, the peak remains off-limits, shrouded in snow and secrets. But some nights, when the wind is just right, you can still hear the whispers calling from the mountain, waiting for their next victim.